Nobody in the family was close to my Uncle Ray. That's not a criticism, just a fact. He was my mother's brother, lived alone in the same house in rural Ohio for 40 years, never married, never explained why, never seemed to feel the need to explain it. He worked as a broadcast radio engineer for 30 years, then retired early and went home, and that was that. Quiet man. Private. You'd see him at Christmas or Thanksgiving, and he'd sit at the table and eat and answer questions when asked, and not ask many of his own. Not unfriendly, just contained. Built for his own company more than other people's. I called him on his birthday when I remembered, which wasn't every year. He never mentioned the years I forgot. He died at 71. The death certificate said natural causes, which is what they write when a man lives alone and dies alone, and nobody is there to say exactly what happened. A neighbor noticed the mail piling up, found him inside. He had been gone 2 or 3 days by then. No will. I was next of kin. I took 3 days off work, loaded my truck with boxes and tape, and drove to Ohio to sort the house. I've done estate work before. You move through it. You make decisions. You don't let yourself slow down too much, or it gets heavy. The house was clean. That was the first thing I noticed. Not a hoarder's house. Not a mess. A private man's house, where everything had a place and was in it. Made the work easier. Bedroom, kitchen, living room, bathroom. I moved through efficiently. Donate pile. Trash pile. Keep pile for the family to go through. The study was last. Small room. A desk, a bookshelf, a filing cabinet. Professional books about radio engineering going back to the 70s. I boxed the books. Went through the filing cabinet, mostly old work documents, and boxed what looked like it might matter and recycled the rest. The desk had 3 drawers. 2 opened fine. The bottom one was locked. I'm an electrician. I've been opening things I'm not supposed to open since I was 19 years old. I got a flathead from my truck and had it open in 2 minutes. Inside was a digital voice recorder. Small, professional grade, the kind of equipment a broadcast engineer would know and trust. Beside it, a charging cable, and a USB drive in a small plastic case, labeled in my uncle's handwriting, Archive, 2001 to 2023. My first thought was that it was work material, old recordings from his broadcast days, the kind of thing a retired engineer might keep for reasons that made sense to him. I almost put it in the box for the electronics recycler. Almost. I don't know why I didn't. I pocketed it instead and kept moving. That night at the motel, I plugged in the recorder. It still held a charge. I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened the folder. 22 years of audio files, named by date. 1 per night, almost without exception, going back to January 2001. I picked a file at random. 2008. Ray's voice came out of my laptop speakers, and I sat back in the motel chair because I had forgotten what he sounded like. Clear and measured, almost an announcer's voice, which made sense given his work. He said the date, said it was overcast, temperature around 40, said he'd gone to the hardware store and fixed a leak under the kitchen sink and eaten dinner and watched some television. That was it. He said goodnight and the file ended. I went back to 2001 and started from the beginning. Same thing. Date, weather, brief account of the day. Sometimes a thought about something on the news. Sometimes just the day's events in plain language. A spoken diary. Private man's private record. Made sense he'd do it in audio rather than writing. He was an audio man his whole life. I fell asleep that night with 3 years of my uncle's evenings playing quietly on my laptop. Rain on the motel parking lot outside. Ray's voice talking about Tuesday in Ohio in 2003. It felt strange and ordinary at the same time. I finished the house the next day, drove home, brought the drive. For the following 2 weeks, I listened in the evenings after dinner, got through 15 years of recordings, 2001 to 2016. There's something strange about listening to a man's private daily record of his own life. You learn things you didn't know. Things nobody knew because he never said them out loud to anyone else. I found out he had a sense of humor. Dry but real. Found out he read a lot. Found out he had a period around 2009 where he seemed genuinely low, though he never named it directly. Just said less. Sounded tired. Then, by 2011, he sounded better again. I started to feel like I knew him. That made me feel bad. Made me feel like I had wasted something while he was alive that I could have had for free just by paying attention. I kept listening. Then 2020. The recordings change in 2020. Not dramatically at first. Not in a way you'd necessarily notice if you weren't listening closely. Ray's voice is the same. He does his usual evening record. Date, weather, day. But after he finishes speaking, before he clicks off, there are pauses. Long ones. Where before he would say goodnight and stop the recording, now he sits in silence for 30 seconds, a minute, longer. Like he's listening to something before he ends the session. At first, the pauses contain nothing. Just the ambient sound of a quiet house at night. The faint hiss that a recording always has underneath everything else. Then, in March 2020, the pauses start to contain something else. I was listening with headphones, regular earbuds, and in a pause that ran about 90 seconds, I heard it for the first time, and I took the earbuds out and sat there for a moment before I put them back in and listened again. A sound. Low. I am an electrician with 28 years of experience, and I have heard every kind of interference, every kind of electrical noise, every kind of artifact that equipment produces, and I am telling you this was not any of those things. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't static. It wasn't equipment malfunction. It was something between a sound and a pattern. Rhythmic but not regular, the way a heartbeat is rhythmic but not metronomic. Like something that had its own internal logic I didn't have the key to. Ray didn't comment on it in the recording. He just let the pause run. Then said goodnight. Then clicked off. I sat in my kitchen for a while before I listened to the next one. By mid-2020, the pauses were longer. 3, 4 minutes sometimes. The sound more present. More structured, though I couldn't have told you what the structure meant. Like listening to a language you've never heard and can't decode, but can recognize as language anyway. Something that has grammar and intention even when you can't follow it. Then, in October 2020, Ray speaks to it for the first time. He finishes his daily record. Pauses. Then he says, "I hear you. I've been hearing you for 8 months. I don't know what you are. I'm going to keep recording, and if you want to respond, you can." Silence. Then the sound. Longer than any previous recording. More present. Ray says, "Okay." Just that one word. Okay. The way a man says okay when something has been confirmed rather than something has been answered. Like a piece of information just passed between them that the recording only partially caught. The last 3 years are different from the first 19. I don't know how else to say it. The recordings from 2001 to 2019 are a private man keeping a private record. The recordings from 2020 to 2023 are something else. They are sessions. One half of a conversation. Ray speaks, then leaves space, then responds to whatever came back to him in that space. His voice across these 3 years is not frightened. That is important, and I want to be clear about it. He sounds engaged, interested. The way a man sounds when he has found something that deserves his full attention, and he knows it. He talks to it the way he probably would have talked to a colleague. Direct, thoughtful, asking questions and then waiting, and then acknowledging what came back in his own way. I couldn't follow most of it. I only had one side. In 2022, he records this, and I played it twice before I moved on. He says, "I've been trying to determine where it originates. Not in the house as far as I can tell. Below it maybe, or in the walls. Or it doesn't have a point of origin the way sounds normally do. I've moved around the house with the recorder. It doesn't get louder or softer based on my location. It's equidistant from everywhere I stand. Like it's inside the recording itself rather than inside the room." Inside the recording itself. I sat with that for a while. I'm a practical man. I went to the practical explanation first. Interference embedded in the device somehow. A signal being picked up and stored with the audio. But Ray was a broadcast engineer for 30 years. If anyone could identify equipment interference, it was him. And he was saying it wasn't that. I kept listening. Early 2023. Ray's voice is slightly different. Quieter. He says, "I think it knows I'm not well. I think it has known for a while. It sounds different lately. More frequent. Like it's trying to get something specific across." I stopped the playback when I heard that. Ray had been sick. I didn't know that. My mother didn't know. Nobody in the family knew because Ray didn't tell anyone. Whatever he had been dealing with it alone in that house, the way he dealt with everything. And whatever was in those recordings had apparently known before any of us did. The last recording is dated 9 days before the neighbor found him. Ray's voice is quiet, tired in a specific way that I recognized once I heard it. The way a person sounds when their body is spending most of its energy on something other than talking. He does his usual record anyway. The date, the weather, a brief account of the day. Then he stops speaking and the pause begins. The sound comes. And it runs longer than any previous recording. Almost 4 full minutes. I sat at my kitchen table with headphones on and listened to all of it. I didn't fast forward. I don't know why it felt wrong to fast forward, but it did. When it finally stops, Ray says 2 words. He says, "I know. I know. I'll be ready." Then he clicks off. That is the last recording. I sat with it for a few days. Tried to think about it the way I think about electrical problems, systematically. I know how signals work. I know how interference works. I know what equipment malfunction sounds like and what it doesn't sound like. I went through every technical explanation I could construct, and I could not make any of them fit what was in those recordings. Ray had lived near some old transmission infrastructure. There was legacy radio equipment in the study. Those were the most plausible sources of interference I could identify. I drove back to Ohio, brought the recorder, brought an EMF meter I use for electrical work, walked the house room by room. Normal readings throughout. Nothing unusual anywhere. I went into the study, sat down at Ray's desk, put the recorder on the desk in front of me, and turned it on and set it to record. sat there for an hour, in the quiet, in my dead uncle's house, in his chair, in the room where he had made 22 years of recordings. I didn't speak. I just sat. Then I played it back. First 40 minutes, room sound, my own breathing, the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen, nothing else. At the 43-minute mark, the sound. I played that section 3 times. Same character as every recording I had listened to. Same rhythm. Same quality that I cannot describe as anything other than structured. It ran 90 seconds. Then it stopped. The rest of the recording was silence. I took the recorder and drove home that night. Didn't stop once. 4 hours straight, which is not how I normally drive. I got home at 2 in the morning and went inside and sat in my kitchen, and that was the first time in probably 30 years that I felt something I would have to call scared. I haven't gone back to the house. 6 months now. The estate is technically still unsettled. I know I need to go back and close it out, and I keep not going. I have the recorder here. I have not used it. I tell myself it's because I don't want to compromise the audio record, which is what an electrician thinks, because an electrician thinks in terms of evidence and documentation. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is that I don't know if it would respond to me the way it responded to Ray. And I genuinely do not know which answer to that question frightens me more. Ray said, "I'll be ready," 9 days before he died. And whatever was in those recordings, whatever had been talking to him for 3 years across those quiet Ohio evenings, it spoke to him longer than it ever had that last night. 4 minutes. And he didn't sound scared. He sounded like a man who had just been told something he had been waiting to hear. Like he'd asked a specific question a long time ago, and the answer had finally come back. I've been an electrician for 28 years. I understand transmission. I understand signals. I understand the difference between noise and information. Whatever was in that recorder was not interference, and it was not malfunction, and it was not a man talking to himself in an empty house at night. It responded, every single time, to what Ray said, for 3 years. And then my uncle died, and I sat in his chair, and it responded to me once. 90 seconds. One time. I don't know what it said. I don't have 22 years of context the way Ray did. I don't have the relationship he built with it, one quiet evening at a time, in that house, in that chair. But I think about those 90 seconds more than I think about most things. Late at night, particularly. I lie there and I think about what it might have been telling me. Whether it was the same thing it eventually told Ray. Whether there's a version of this where I go back and I sit in that chair and I turn on the recorder and I listen the way Ray listened, patiently and without fear, until I understand enough to understand what it's saying. Ray wasn't a foolish man. He wasn't a frightened man, and I think that's the thing that stays with me most. He knew what he had found, and he chose to stay with it, and he died in that house on his own terms, as prepared as a man can be. Some nights that sounds like the worst thing I've ever heard. Some nights it sounds like something else entirely. I go back and forth. I'm glad I don't know what those 90 seconds meant. I'm pretty sure I'm glad about that. I'm just not completely sure. "44 years old, and I had a breakdown. I'm not going to spend time explaining what that means or how it happened. People who have been there don't need the explanation, and people who haven't wouldn't fully understand it anyway. What I'll say is this. For a period of time, I stopped being able to function. And then, slowly, I started again. That's the whole of it. My doctor suggested a change of scenery. She used that exact phrase, change of scenery, like I was a houseplant that needed to be moved away from a drafty window. I didn't argue. I wasn't in a position to argue with much of anything at that point. My sister found a rental through some website she used for vacations, a cabin on a small private lake in northern Michigan. Off-season rate because it was November and nobody goes to a lake cabin in Michigan in November. Nearly empty area, quiet roads, cold and gray and still. I drove up alone. Everything I needed in a duffel bag and 2 boxes. Books, basic food. My medication in a paper bag from the pharmacy. A notebook my therapist wanted me to write in every day, which I did for the first week, and then did sporadically, and then stopped doing entirely, though I didn't tell her that. Some things you manage differently than you planned to. The cabin was simple and good. Wood walls, a stone fireplace that worked well once I figured out the damper, a covered porch across the entire front of the house facing the lake. I stood on that porch the first evening I arrived, still in my coat, and I looked at the water and I thought, this is going to help. I genuinely believed that. The lake was small, maybe 300 feet across, ringed entirely by pine trees that came right down to the water's edge. A dock out front, wooden, slightly weathered. The surface of the lake was flat and dark and perfectly still in the late afternoon light. I thought it was the most peaceful thing I had seen in a long time. 3 days in, I noticed something wrong with the water. I had been watching the lake every morning and every evening from the porch. It had become a kind of ritual without me deciding to make it one. Coffee in the morning, the lake in front of me. A few minutes of just looking. I found it calming. The stillness of it. The way it sat there like a piece of dark glass set into the ground. On the 3rd day, a hard wind came in from the northwest. I could hear it before I could feel it, moving through the pines with that specific sound that pines make. I stepped out onto the porch, and the cold hit me, and I could feel the air moving, pushing against my jacket, my face. Branches overhead were bending. The pine needles were loud. It was a real wind, the kind that makes you lean into it slightly. The lake didn't move, not a ripple, not a shiver on the surface, nothing. The trees around its edge were bending and swaying, and the surface of the lake sat completely flat, completely still, like it existed in a different kind of air than everything around it. I stood watching for 20 minutes. The wind kept coming. The pines kept moving. The lake stayed motionless. I told myself it was geography. The tree line shelters certain bodies of water. Some lakes sit in a kind of natural bowl where the surrounding land and trees break the wind before it reaches the surface. I am not an outdoorsman. I don't know lakes. Maybe this was perfectly normal, and I simply didn't have the frame of reference to know it. But it bothered me. Something about that stillness felt different from ordinary calm. It took me a while to find the right way to put it in my own mind. The difference, I finally decided, was like the difference between a person sleeping and a person lying very still with their eyes closed. Both look the same. One of them is at rest. The other one is doing something. I drove into the nearest town the following day. Small place. A hardware store, a bar that also served lunch, a post office, a gas station. I stopped at the bar and ate a sandwich and got talking to the bartender the way you do when you're the only person at the counter. He was friendly enough. We talked about nothing for a while. At some point, I mentioned the lake. Said I was renting the cabin on it. Said it by name. His manner shifted. Not dramatically. He didn't go cold or unfriendly, but something behind his eyes closed off the way a door closes, quietly and completely. He said it was a nice lake, said the cabin was comfortable, good place to spend some time. Then he found something to do at the other end of the bar. We didn't talk much after that. I went back to the cabin and looked around more carefully than I had on arrival. I had unpacked and settled in without really searching the place. Now I went through it properly. The back bedroom had a closet I hadn't opened. Inside, wrapped in an old bedsheet and leaned against the back wall, was a painting. Oil on canvas. Naive style. This wasn't a trained artist, but it wasn't careless work either. Someone who painted for themselves, for the act of it, and had done it long enough to develop a kind of competence. The brushwork was patient. It showed the lake. From the porch perspective, the exact angle I had been standing at every morning and evening. I recognized the dock immediately. The tree line. The way the pines came down to the left side closer than the right. Whoever painted this had stood exactly where I had been standing. The lake in the painting was still, the same flat, glassy stillness the real lake had. The painter had understood that quality and put it in the work. It wasn't just a still moment captured. It was the stillness as a permanent condition. You could look at that painting and understand without being told that the water was always this way. And just below the surface of the painted water, visible the way things are visible in very clear, very still water when the light is right, there was a shape. Large, not clearly defined at the edges. The painter hadn't tried to define it precisely, maybe because they couldn't, maybe because they understood that precision would make it smaller than it was. But it was a shape with intention to it. That is the only way I know how to put it. There is a difference between a shape that is simply present and a shape that is oriented toward something. A rock on the bottom of a lake has no orientation. This shape did. It was facing upward, toward the surface, toward the sky above the surface, toward anyone standing on the porch looking down at the water. I propped the painting against the living room wall and sat in a chair across from it and looked at it for a long time. Then I went out to the porch and looked at the real lake. The afternoon light was on it. I looked at the surface, and then I looked through the surface, the way you do when you're trying to see into water from a distance. I saw nothing below the surface. But the lake here is dark. The pines block most of the direct light, and the water holds its darkness the way dark water does. It could be 10 feet deep or 100, and I would not be able to tell from the porch. I went back inside and turned the painting to face the wall. That evening, I started trying to find out who had owned the cabin before the rental company. The county property register is online. It took me an hour of patient searching. The name I found was Thomas Veach. He had owned the property from 1987 to 2019, when he sold it to the rental management company. 32 years. I found a Thomas Veach living in a town 40 minutes south, retired. I drove there the next morning. He was 70 years old, answered the door in a flannel shirt, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at me the way you look at someone you were expecting, but weren't sure would actually come. He said, "You're staying at the lake." Not a question, a statement, calm and certain. I said yes. He stepped back from the door and let me in. He was not a dramatic man. He didn't build to anything or perform anything. He sat in his kitchen and told me what he knew, the way a person tells you something they have been carrying a long time and are ready to set down. He said the lake had always been that way. Still, even in storms, even in high wind. His father had told him the same thing when he first bought the property, had said it as though it were a simple fact of the place. The way you'd mention that the roof needed work, or that the well ran a little slow. His father had gotten the property from a man before him who had mentioned the same stillness in the same tone. It went back past anyone Veach knew. I asked about the painting. He looked at me steadily and said he made it. Painted it in 2017. Said he had wanted to document what he saw before he sold the place. He had been on the dock early one November morning. His last November there, as it turned out. No wind. The surface like glass, the way it always was. He had been standing at the end of the dock, looking down into the water, the way you find yourself doing when you're alone and the world is quiet. He said something looked back. He sat with that for a moment before he continued. He said he couldn't describe it more precisely than that. Large. Not any animal he had a name for. It was close to the surface, not touching it, but just below. And it was completely still the way the lake was completely still. Like it and the lake operated by the same rules. What bothered him most, he said, was not what it was. It was what it was doing. It was watching him. Clearly, and with what he could only call patience. Not aggressive. Not frightened of him. Not alarmed by the light or his presence on the dock above it. Just watching. The way you watch something you have been watching for a very long time and intend to keep watching. He sold the cabin 2 years after that morning. Said he was not a superstitious man and didn't want to be. But he said the feeling of being watched from below the water, every time he stood on that porch, every morning, every evening, for those last 2 years, had become something he could not carry any longer. He asked me how long I was planning to stay. I told him I had booked 6 weeks. He nodded. He didn't tell me not to go back. He just nodded in the way that means a man has heard something and made his own private decision about it. Before I left, I asked him one thing. Whether anyone had ever gone into the water, swum in the lake. He said his dog had gone in once. First summer he owned the place. A retriever. Good dog, easy-natured, loved water the way that breed does. Jumped off the dock after a stick without hesitation. He paused for a moment before he finished. The dog came out fine, swam back to the dock and climbed out and shook itself dry. But it never went near the water again. In 14 years, that dog would not go on the dock, would not go to the shore, would not stand on the porch when the door was open. If Veach opened the porch door, the dog went directly to the back bedroom and stayed there. He looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Whatever's in that lake, it doesn't take anything. It doesn't do anything that I know of. It just watches. And that's almost worse, because you can never know what it's waiting for." I drove back to the cabin. I sat on the porch in the evening dark and looked at the lake for a long time. The water was flat and black and perfectly still. I sat there until I was cold, and then I went inside. I stayed for my 6 weeks. I'm still not entirely sure why. Part of it was stubbornness. Part of it was that I had nowhere better to be. And part of it, the part I wrote about once in the notebook I was supposed to be filling, and then crossed out because I didn't want my therapist to read it, was that the stillness of the lake matched something in me. The quality of it. The deep, deliberate quiet. I was a man trying to find stillness in himself after a long period of chaos, and outside my window was the stillest thing I had ever seen. There was something in that I couldn't walk away from easily. Week 4, I swam in the lake. I didn't plan it. I want to be clear about that because I don't want it to sound like a decision I thought through, because I didn't. It was early morning, cold and gray, and I walked out onto the dock in my clothes, and then I just walked off the end of it, into the water. The cold hit me hard. Dark water, cold, and I couldn't see anything below me. I treaded water and looked down and saw nothing but dark. I stayed in maybe 2 minutes. The whole time I was in there, nothing happened. Nothing surfaced. Nothing came up from below. Nothing touched me. I was not pulled under. I was not threatened in any way I could name or measure, but I was observed. From below me, from somewhere in that dark I couldn't see into, something was looking up. I felt it the way you feel eyes on you in a dark room before you turn the light on. Not imagined, not anxiety, a specific and very clear sensation of being seen by something that had been there long before me and would be there long after. I got out, sat on the dock with my wet clothes and looked at the water. After a while, I went inside and changed. I didn't go back in. I left at the end of my 6 weeks, drove back down to my life, my apartment, my therapist, the slow and mostly ordinary process of becoming functional again. I did not tell my therapist about the lake. I thought about how I would explain it, and I couldn't find the right way in, so I didn't go in at all. Some things you carry differently than you plan to. I took the painting when I left. I'm not sure the rental company knows it's gone, and they haven't asked. It's in my apartment now, in the bedroom closet, leaned against the back wall facing inward, the same way I found it. I think about that morning in the water more than I think about most things. Not with fear exactly. It's not fear. It's closer to recognition. I spent 6 months not knowing what was underneath me, not knowing what lived in the dark below my own thinking, what was moving around down there in the time I couldn't see clearly. That was the worst of it. Not the darkness itself, but the not knowing what was in it. And then I got into that lake, and something down there looked up at me, and I looked down at it, and neither of us moved, and neither of us left. And I thought, treading water in the cold with nothing solid below me, okay, I know you're there. You know I'm here. That can be enough. That can be all this has to be. I got out. I sat on the dock. I felt better in a way that I still don't have a clean explanation for. The painting is still facing the wall. I haven't looked at it since I brought it home. I know what's in it. I don't need to look at it to know. Sometimes at night, when the apartment is quiet, I think about what Veach said in his kitchen. That it just watches. That it doesn't take anything or do anything. That the only question is what it's waiting for. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure I want to. Some things are bearable precisely because they stay below the surface. You learn that when you've been as far down as I've been. Some things are better left in the dark, looked at once, acknowledged, and then left alone to do whatever it is they do in the quiet. Whatever is in that lake, it has been there longer than the cabin, longer than Veach, longer than anyone who left a name in a property record. It was there before any of us stood on that dock and looked down. It will be there after. It's still watching. I'm fairly certain of that. I just don't know what for. Something I should tell you up front. I am not a man who spooks easily. Grew up rural, outside of Cookville. Fixed my own vehicle since I was 16. Spent 2 years in the Army before I decided I'd rather work with computers than people, and taught myself IT. I moved out to 3 acres in rural Tennessee 6 years ago because city life had stopped making sense to me, and I was done pretending otherwise. I don't say any of this to sound impressive. I say it so you understand the kind of man who found what I found. Because the kind of man matters when you're trying to figure out whether to believe a thing. My dog is named Cass. Mixed breed, some kind of hound in there somewhere, 8 years old. I've had her since she was 10 weeks and weighed 4 pounds. She is not a nervous animal, never has been. She sleeps through thunderstorms, sleeps through the coyotes that come down from the ridge some nights, sleeps through everything. Calm, steady dog. The kind of dog that makes you think you've done something right. In September, she started waking me up at 3 in the morning, scratching at the back door, Not barking, just that steady scratch that means she needs out and she means it. I got up the first night thinking she had to go. Let her out and followed her with a flashlight, because that's what you do when you're half asleep and responsible for an animal. She didn't go to any of her usual spots. She went straight to the far corner of the yard near the back fence, the corner where the ground stays a little damp from the drainage off the hill, and she started digging. I watched her for a minute, then I brought her in. She did it the next night, and the one after that. Same time, same corner, same focused digging. By the end of the first week, she had a hole about a foot deep in that spot, and I had a week's worth of interrupted sleep and no explanation. I filled the hole in after that first week. Figured there was something underneath she could smell. A mole run, or something dead and buried from years back. The property is old land. I bought it from an estate sale 6 years ago. Previous owner, an elderly man who died without any family. Could have been a buried pet from decades back, or any number of things that get put in the ground on a rural property over the years. I tamped the dirt back down and figured that would be the end of it. She dug it back out the following night. Same spot, same depth. 3 in the morning. I went out with her the second week on a few nights and just watched. She digs with a focused, steady purpose that I want to be specific about because it matters. Not the frantic digging of a dog that's excited or anxious. Methodical. Like she had a measurement in her head and was working toward it. She'd dig for a while, stop, sniff the hole, dig some more. Never got distracted. Never wandered off to check something else. At the end of the second week, I'd had enough of guessing. I got a proper shovel and dug it out myself. Whatever was down there, I wanted to know what it was and settle it. About 18 inches down, the shovel hit something solid and rang with that specific sound that means metal. I cleared around it carefully. A tin box. Old, hinged lid, sealed with a rubber gasket that had mostly rotted through, but had held just enough to keep the interior dry. The box was the size of a thick hardcover book, maybe a little larger. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table. Cass lay down by the door and watched me with her chin on her paws. Calm as she always is. Inside the box there was a bundle of papers, handwritten on loose pages, held together with a rubber band that crumbled into pieces when I touched it. I spread them out on the table and counted them. 11 pages. Some just a few lines long, some close to a full page. Each one had a date at the top. The dates ran from 2031 to 2038, 15 to 22 years from now. And each one started with my name. My full name, first and last. Correct. I read the first note. It described a specific morning in December of next year, as it turned out. I'm on the county road south of my property. I pull over to help a woman whose car has gone off the shoulder in icy conditions. The note describes the color of her coat, the make of her car. It says I should get her number. It says something about her is important, and I'll understand that better later. I set that one down. Read the next. It described a situation at work, a decision I'd be asked to make in 2033. The note told me which choice to make. Said the other path would cost me 3 years, though it didn't explain how. I read all 11. They covered my life across the next 2 decades in pieces. Not everything, not a continuous account, just moments. Some were practical advice. Choose this one. Don't sign that. Go to this place in this year. Some were pure description, just accounts of things I would apparently see or do, written with the easy familiarity of someone describing what they'd already seen happen. Then I noticed the handwriting. I had been reading for content and not looking at the mechanics of it. I looked at the mechanics of it. I stared at the pages for a while, not quite letting myself arrive at the thought that was forming. I went to the notepad I keep on the counter by the coffee maker and I wrote my full name on it. I carried it back to the table and held it next to the notes. Same handwriting. The specific way I make a lowercase g, closing the tail differently than most people do. The way my T crossings land slightly left of center. The particular pressure I put on certain letters. I spent 2 years in my mid-20s doing data entry, and I know my own handwriting the way I know my own face. These were my notes. I sat at that table until the sun came up. I am an IT man. I troubleshoot for a living. I start with the most rational explanation, and I work outward from there only when I have to. Someone forged my handwriting and buried these before I bought the property. Except they would have needed my full name before I ever came here, and they would have needed to replicate handwriting that belongs to me specifically, including the quirks that developed in my 20s, years after anyone could have buried something here expecting me to find it. The previous owner died with no family and no connection to me. I have looked at the chain of ownership on this property going back to the 1940s. There is no thread that connects to me before I arrived. The paper is old. Not ancient, but yellowed and brittle in the way paper gets over 10 to 30 years. The ink is faded in the way ink fades. None of that tells me when exactly they were buried because the range is too wide. Someone could have put them in the ground at any point across a span of 3 decades. I am not a man who believes in time travel. I want to be clear about that because I'm aware of how this sounds. I don't believe in much that can't be observed and tested, but I believe in handwriting. I believe in what I can see and compare with my own eyes. I went back to the first note, the one about the woman on the county road in December, and I read it through again, carefully. I had skimmed the end of it the first time. The last line said, "You'll find these in the fall, September probably. Cass will lead you to them. She always does. Don't be afraid of what they are. Just use them. You spent enough time in your life not knowing what was coming. Now you do. Make it count." I looked at Cass. She looked back at me from her spot by the door. Calm. Settled. Like she had completed something she had been asked to do. I did the practical things because that is what I do. I photographed all 11 notes clearly and found a handwriting analyst through a forensic services directory online. Sent her the photographs along with a clean sample of my current handwriting. 2 pages of normal writing I did specifically for the comparison. She got back to me 4 days later. She said the handwriting was either mine or an extraordinarily precise forgery, and in her professional judgment, it was not a forgery. She said the natural inconsistencies, the slight variations in letter formation that change based on mood and fatigue and the pen being used, were all consistent with a single writer across what appeared to be a long period of time. Different pages showed subtle differences, the way a person's handwriting naturally shifts across years. She said it read like the same person writing at different points across decades. I asked her, trying to keep the question plain, whether that was possible. She said from a handwriting standpoint, yes. The tin box is on the shelf in my study now. I put the notes back inside it. I can see it from where I sit when I'm working. I've read the notes many more times than I've admitted to anyone. I haven't acted on any of them yet. I keep going back and forth on whether I should. Whether using them changes what they predict or confirms it. Whether they're a record of something that will happen regardless, or a set of instructions that only produce their outcome if I follow them. I don't have the right kind of mind for that question, and I've accepted that I probably never will. December is coming. I've been driving the county road south of the property more than I used to. Not every day, just more than before. I watch the shoulder of the road when the weather is bad. I don't know the color of the coat yet. I don't know the make of the car. Cass sleeps in the yard most afternoons now, in the thin fall sun. She hasn't gone back to the corner by the fence since the night I dug up the box. Whatever she was looking for, she found, and she's satisfied. She seems settled in the way she always seems settled, like an animal that doesn't carry anything it doesn't need. I've tried to work out what version of me put those notes in that box, what I would have had to go through to decide to do it, what I would have had to figure out first, or experience first, to know that it was worth doing, and whether the man sitting at this table in September is on the same track as the man who wrote those notes, or whether finding them already changed something enough that I'm running on a different line now and the notes don't fully apply. I can't settle it. That's the honest answer. I'm a practical man. I fix what's broken and I leave what isn't alone. But I dug up that box, and Cass led me to it night after night until I did. And now I know what I know, which is that at some point in the next 20-odd years, I will have figured out something significant enough to put in the ground for myself to find. I just haven't lived long enough yet to know what it was.